Hello, good afternoon. A member of the council that advises the government on drugs has resigned in protest against the sacking of the body's chairman. Les King says he thinks other scientists may follow his lead in quitting the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. It follows the Home Secretary Alan Johnson's decision to dismiss Professor David Nutt, who he said had crossed the line by campaigning against government policy on the reclassification of cannabis from a Class C to a Class B drug.
If the government makes arbitrary decisions which are not based on the evidence, there is a risk, of course, of the law falling into disrepute. And the real concern that I have is that people will misuse these drugs because if they see the law as being silly, they won't take any notice of it. And that, I think, is a real issue for science.
So do you essentially agree that...
Is the advice. We have to take the decisions and be big enough and strong enough and bold enough to stand up on those decisions. What you cannot have, and I'll say this again because it is absolutely crucial to this, you cannot have a chief advisor at the same time stepping into the political field and campaigning against government decisions. You can do one or the other, you can't do both.
The chair of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs was effectively told to stand down after criticising the government's decision to upgrade cannabis from a Class C to a Class B drug. Professor David Nutt is accused by the Home Secretary of crossing the line.
This government has made the law and then it's gone back to the Advisory Council and said, could you find some evidence to support our decision? And we've said, no, we will stick to our scientific guns, we will produce the evidence, and if you go and legislate inappropriately, we will continue to point out the evidence doesn't support you.
Professor Nutt says the position of scientists on the committee is untenable, and now at least one other member of the committee has quit in protest.
I don't think he did transgress this imaginary line between science and policy. I don't think there's anything contentious in that, and I don't think, if you do think it's contentious, it's still within the bounds of what he's got a right to say under freedom of expression.
There's further pressure on the Home Secretary now over his handling of the affair.
If the government makes arbitrary decisions which are not based on the evidence, there is a risk, of course, of the law falling into disrepute. And the real concern that I have is that people will misuse these drugs because if they see the law as being silly, they won't take any notice of it. And that, I think, is a real issue for science.
The Home Office says there have been no other resignation letters received by Mr Johnson, but more scientists could still resign. Tim Reid, BBC News.
Well, Dr. Les King joins me now from Basingstoke. A very good afternoon to you. Dr. King, just explain to us why you decided to resign.
My principal reason in resigning was that David Nutt was denied freedom of expression. The Home Secretary appeared to rule out the possibility that he could comment on matters that we're all free to comment on. And I distinguish those sort of comments, which may verge on the political, from quite separately from advice that he gives to ministers. My second reason is that the advice of the Council has been regularly ignored. Now, the government is free to take our advice and reject it if they wish, but it does raise the question of what is the purpose of the Advisory Council, which we serve on in our own time, if our advice is consistently ignored.
And when your advice was being ignored, what sort of conversations did you have with the government, or your panel have with the government about it?
Well, I think the reaction of the Council was one of dismay, but we recognise that we advise and the government takes decisions, but we can't carry on like that, giving advice, scientific-based advice on harms of substances, if it's completely ignored.
Is it the end of the road for the Council then? Is it the end of the road for the Council, do you think?
Well, if sufficient members resign, then yes, it is, because it will become inoperative. It needs a quorum to operate. It needs certain key people, which are set out in the Act, to operate. If they resign, then the government, the Home Office, will have to replace them. And in the meantime, there'll be a vacuum. Now, this publicity is not going to endear academics, medics, drug workers, others to apply for posts on the Council. Particularly as there's no payment made. It's something we do in our own time.
And your colleagues,
we spend a lot of time doing it.
Your colleagues, what are they saying to you? Do you expect more resignations?
I expect there may be more resignations, yes.
All of them?
I don't know about all of them. I think in some cases, and let me say this, we are expected to serve on the Council in our own capacity as individual experts. Some members of the council have got institutional affiliations which may make it difficult for them. There are 2 police officers, for example. There are others who are employed. Maybe their organisations would have a view on whether they should resign or not. But it doesn't need the whole council to resign for the thing to fall apart.
How's all of this being viewed within the scientific world?
How is it being viewed?
Yeah.
I think you've seen some comments today from others outside the council. I think it's perhaps another example of the way this government treats scientific advice in general and scientists.
Do you think that it's worthwhile going back to the government, talking to them again, perhaps telling them your advice again, perhaps trying to make them see reason, or do you think they just cherry-pick what they want?
Well, they do cherry-pick what they want. If you're asking me about what the future of this is, then I would like to see the Advisory Council become a body separate from the government. Just as NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, is separate from government and is free to make decisions, free of political interference, just as the Monetary Commission, for example, of the Bank of England, is free to make decisions on interest rates. That's what we need, I think, because the classification of drugs is about drug harm. It doesn't need to be politicised in the way that it is.
What do you make of the government statements about the classification of drugs and the fact that they are contrary to what your council said?
Well, certainly some of the drugs are, we believe, misclassified. Now, initially, we can perhaps concentrate on ecstasy, MDMA. When that was first added to the Act in 1977, it was probably appropriate that it was made a Class A drug because we didn't know very much about it. It was 10 years before misuse of that substance appeared in the United Kingdom. And in that situation, it's probably correct to use what we might call the precautionary principle. But now we know so much more about ecstasy and other drugs. And our review, as you recall, recommended that ecstasy should be reclassified to Class B.
Dr. King, just one final question and briefly. Do you expect all of the scientists on the council to resign?
I think some of them will. I really can't speak for them, but I've been in contact with them and I know, I can tell you this, that many of them are angry at the sacking of David and they're generally angry at the way matters have gone on in the Advisory Council in the last few years.
OK, Dr. Les King, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.